Hey everybody, two Alpha Gals here. I'm Debbie Nichols.
And I'm Candace Mathis, and you're listening to In the Tall Grass, where we're sharing stories of reinvention, resilience, and rediscovering joy.
Whether it's facing Alpha Gal syndrome or any other redefining chapter of life, we all have to learn how to navigate the journey through the tall grass. So here we go.
This episode is sponsored by Insect Shield. The very best part of every day for me is my morning walk to the barn with my spaniel Bowie. Rain or shine, snow or sleet, we put on our gear and head outside. And by outside, I mean I walk down the gravel to the barn, but Bowie runs directly into the woods. I used to panic about the ticks he would bring back to the house, but now I know he's protected from ticks by Insect Shield.
Insect Shield not only sells products for humans, but they also have apparel and gear for our furry friends like Bowie too. Their vests, gaiters, bandanas, and more are all treated with permethrin to repel mosquitoes, fleas, ticks, and flies to add an extra layer of protection for hikes, walks around the neighborhood, or even trips to the barn. Check out insectshield.com for more information on their EPA-registered products, and be sure to use code 2ALPHAGALS, that's TWO, ALPHAGALS, to save 15% on your first order. Your purchase not only saves you money, but it also directly supports the work we're doing at 2 Alpha Gals. Hey, everybody. We are super excited today to have our dear friend and the brain behind alphagalinformation.org. She is a brilliant mind, Sharon Forsyth. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
We know that you don't do this a lot, join podcasts, and so it's an honor to chat with you today.
Anything for you too.
You're so sweet. So, okay, let's jump in, and can you just share a little bit with our listeners? Tell us who you are and what led you to starting alphagalinformation.org.
Well, I was diagnosed with alpha-gal syndrome in 2019, and I was told that it was a red meat allergy. So I stopped eating mammalian meat, and I was still sick. I just got sicker and sicker, actually, for the first couple of months. And so I started reading papers about alpha-gal syndrome, and I still couldn't figure out why I was sick. So I joined some support groups, and in the support groups, I learned that people with alpha-gal syndrome also can react to dairy and gelatin and mammalian byproducts. And I was kind of shocked that there was no Mayo Clinic website or good information on the CDC or anything. And there wasn't even a paper for physicians on the diagnosis or management of alpha-gal syndrome at that point. So I just decided the community needed a resource, and I didn't want other people to have to go through what I had gone through to try and figure out the information. So I started talking to a whole lot of people in the alpha-gal syndrome community, over 100 volunteers, actually. We worked to put together whatever information we could find. I read all the papers that were available, tried to pull out the little bits and pieces that would be helpful to patients, and that's how it all started.
For those of you who are listening who haven't been to Alpha Gal Information, it is a wealth of useful, accurate knowledge. That is where we go to find information. It is just such a helpful resource, sharing what you've done or what you've built for this community. So I personally want to thank you for having put that together for myself as well as everybody out there. It's a great place for us to direct people to go when they're looking for something very specific.
Well, it makes me really happy when I hear that somebody got something out of it.
It would be impossible not to. It'd be impossible not to. I love that it is so well sourced, right? You have explanations from where you get all the information. So much of it comes from even the research that's being done from Dr. Cummins. It's just really valuable. And like I mentioned, accurate information, which I think is important to point out when there is so much misinformation out there right now.
Actually, adding the citations was probably the most time-consuming part of creating the website. But I realized it would be useless for physicians and journalists and also people writing papers about alpha-gal syndrome for medical journals. without, the references, because they can't really reference a patient created website for a medical paper.
Right.
Right.
So they need to go to the original source, and I try to direct them there.
It must have been an enormous amount of time, because it actually gives me heart palpitations going back to like my college years, thinking about doing citations in papers.
Yeah. We're so grateful that you enjoy doing that, because I just cannot even imagine diving into it or knowing where to dive into all of the research and deciphering between all of, I'm sure now you're having to keep up with so much that's coming out as, everything's evolved.
All your nightmares about being back in school are my reality. Oh no, too much reading. I can't keep up with it.
That's funny.
It just goes to show you how, everyone in this community, their strengths are needed, right? Like, what would we do without you? I can't even imagine. Like Debbie said, you were the first, website that we came upon when we were diagnosed, and we were like, oh my gosh, it just was such a helpful guide. And we are all of our strengths are needed to forge forward.
Absolutely. I like to say that we have a bad condition, but a great community. And we're just kind of fortuitous that those people who have come forward and wanted to work in this space have really complementary skills. Like for your listeners, like, don't know this, but we were all together yesterday because we were down in Virginia working on a project that I'm sure you'll introduce. But, there's you guys who are so great with media and communicating with patients. I've got the research piece and the, oversized website. And then Julie Sibbing, whom I've been working with recently, just has such a deep understanding of how to work in the legislative space. And then we've got Sage Alpha-Gal, who's doing her own thing. She really understands, media and public relations and this kind of thing. So we're very lucky.
It is really neat how it's come together. I was thinking that yesterday when we were all together. We actually had the opportunity to testify in front of the House of Delegates in Virginia regarding this bill we're going to discuss in just a second. But it was really beautiful, because I think the chairman actually said, we don't want to hear the same thing over and over again. And I was thinking, oh, no, we don't have the same thing to say at all. We all have really different things to say. And so, but they all just sort of, like you said, complemented each other so much. And so that is kind of a nice segue into talking about this bill, HB 93. Do you mind sharing with our listeners a little bit more about it and why it's important?
Yes. So one of the main impediments to getting any federal legislation passed that would benefit the alpha-gal syndrome community, like adding alpha-gal to the list of top food allergens, which would then require that it would have to be listed on the labels of foods, or passing legislation that would require alpha-gal to be listed on drugs and medical products, which would probably be the thing that we would all be most delighted by. An impediment to that is that we don't really have the numbers. So when I was diagnosed, it was thought that there was 5,000 people with alpha-gal syndrome, and that was only 4 years ago. And then in 2020 or something, I'm not quite sure about the date, they decide, CDC's estimate was increased to 34,000. And then in 2023, they said, oh, well, we might have up to 450,000 people in the United States with alpha-gal syndrome. And actually, many of us who have really scrutinized the numbers think that probably that is even an underestimate. But unless we can actually get data confirming those numbers, it's really hard to move forward and justify, federal action at all. So how are we going to get those numbers? I mean, the past CDC has used numbers from a lab that everybody was using to test people for the allergic antibody to alpha-gal. But now many of the labs, or at least LabCorp, has created their own test. So it's going to be, there's not going to be that central database. So directly counting the numbers of people who are diagnosed with alpha-gal seems like the best way forward for actually documenting the numbers. And they're already doing that for other tick-borne diseases. And alpha-gal is an allergy, but it's also a tick-borne disease. So this is really just adding alpha-gal to the list of tick-borne diseases that are reported to the CDC.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think it's so necessary. I mean, when we were sitting there talking, you know, when we've all four of us were talking about how we were going to present this, you know, it made us dive into like how complex this is and how necessary it is, because it affects every aspect of our life in ways that the general population that does not have to navigate alpha-gal, you don't even think about. And when we were presenting, I don't know, Sharon, if you noticed this, but I told Debbie afterwards, I wish I would have been able to video the delegates' faces when we were speaking, because their eyes just kept getting wider and wider with we were going
That
through.
is so true. I noticed the same thing. They kind of looked a little bit like they were in shock.
Right.
But we've all seen that look a million times.
Right.
Sometimes tinted with, you know, a bit of disbelief, because I think it's hard for people to understand just how complex this allergy is to manage. Because, you know, alpha-gal is just in absolutely everything. That is completely unlike any other allergen. And
Yes.
then also just the severity of our reactions isn't something that most people understand, even people with other allergens. It does seem like some kind of a crazy tale if you aren't familiar with it.
Yeah.
No, it seems, you know, it's almost like the Spider-Man tale, except that we didn't get like cool superhero powers. We get anaphylaxis instead.
Reverse Spider-Man.
Yes, reverse Spider-Man disorder or something. Exactly. Exactly. You know, it was interesting. Many of you probably saw this already, but before we went to Richmond to testify, we put out on social media a call for people to give us, you know, in one sentence, the biggest challenge to living with alpha-gal syndrome. And there are so many, right? And there's such a breadth of these challenges, like you said, in everything from medication to food to toilet paper, right? To all these things. But we found it so interesting that really no one was drawing the biggest challenge as giving up hamburgers or steak or, you know, cheese or any of those things. It was all things like, you know, being dismissed by their healthcare providers, or the lack of awareness, the lack of knowledge, the lack of understanding from even their closest support systems. And so I think that this bill really is a necessary first step so that we can start to address all those things, so that we can solidify alpha-gal for what it is. So then we can go forward and talk about educating healthcare providers, raising awareness, increasing tick bite prevention education. But we can't do that, like you said, without proper surveillance, so that we have an idea of the true prevalence of alpha-gal syndrome, starting here in Virginia, and hopefully it would become, you know, nationwide. But we start somewhere. I guess Arkansas was the first, right? Arkansas has passed this. Is that correct?
Arkansas was the first, and Jennifer Burton, who has her own really wonderful organization, alpha-gal Encouragers, where she provides a lot of direct support for patients. She was instrumental in that, as were many other people in Arkansas, and as was Tina Merritt of Tick-Borne Conditions United. So yeah, I think in the context of Virginia, there are some additional considerations that make this bill really important, because when you're thinking about tick-borne disease, you always think about Lyme disease, because Lyme disease affects so many people. But Lyme disease is really more associated with black-legged ticks, and black-legged ticks are more of like a northeast a northern phenomenon. And in Virginia, 95% of all the tick bites are Lone Star ticks. And the tick-borne conditions that are associated with Lone Star ticks are different. There's little more than 1,200 cases of Lyme disease in Virginia every year. And there are smaller numbers of even more dangerous and alarming diseases. But none of those rise anywhere near to the level of alpha-gal syndrome, which is affecting thousands and thousands of people, up to 2 to 3% of the population in some areas. And it's a condition that lasts your entire life. So the bulk of the tick-borne disease burden in Virginia really is alpha-gal syndrome. And if you're going to justify Virginia accessing federal resources for tick bite prevention, for educating doctors about tick-borne disease, and for other federal funds related to tick-borne disease, you really need to document the numbers of people with alpha-gal, because that's really where the problem lies. And also, I don't know if you've experienced this, but when you talk to people about tick-borne disease, they will often say like, oh, I wouldn't want to get tick-borne, I wouldn't want to get Lyme disease, but like I'd kill myself if I got that red meat allergy. It's and my husband actually almost died of a tick-borne disease, as did my dad. My dad almost died of anaplasmosis, and Adrian almost died of Powassan virus. He was in a coma as a child. But, you know, and that was an awful experience. But my husband, who also has alpha-gal syndrome, has to live with the burden of, you know, this condition for the rest of his life. And it's been, you know, affecting the quality of his life for decades. It impacts his work, because when he's traveling, he's a field biologist and he works in Latin America. And, you know, it can be extremely difficult in remote areas of the Amazon to get food that isn't contaminated with mammalian byproducts. Mm. So yeah, these other diseases are very serious, but just because most people don't die of alpha-gal syndrome doesn't really detract from the burden for people who have it.
Right. Yeah. Like we have lived that for the past 5 years, if not, you know, I know Debbie and I probably have had this for much longer, but within the past 5 years, it's been more extreme, you know, and I don't think you realize at first, like giving up red meat is the easy part.
You know, I didn't realize at all. I was just like, oh, I can't eat red meat. No big deal. I almost never eat it anyway. And this would be kind of like a good discipline to ensure that like I don't eat it at all, because it's healthier not to eat red meat. And I was just had that short period of blissful naivete in which I thought, oh, maybe this is a good thing. I'm going to be healthier now.
Right.
But yeah, then I was just like, the anvil fell on my head when, you know, first dairy, then gelatin, then byproducts. And then I discovered, you know, the complications of medical care with alpha-gal. And for me, I don't know how you guys feel, but for me, that is by far the most significant difficulty of having alpha-gal syndrome, is trying to figure out how to safely navigate healthcare with this thing.
That's what we were talking about on the drive home yesterday, how terrifying that was. And we heard that from people in that same poll on social media too. You know, what happens if I pass out and they give me medication, or if I have to be anesthetized and they give me medication that would trigger a reaction, and they don't know what to do, right? I mean, I think there's some this could be an entirely separate conversation probably over on the podcast, but I think, you know, there's something to be said about the fact that you have to prioritize when it comes to medical care. And, you know, if you need life-saving measures that are going to trigger an alpha-gal reaction, you've got to think about what your priorities are in a medical setting. But it is the fact that we have to think about that is terrifying. I mean, it really is. Like Candace said, and you said, giving up the red meat was actually the easy part.
Yeah.
But I'm always caught off guard when people say that. And we've heard that exact phrase multiple times. I would kill myself if I had to give up burgers or bacon or steak or fill in the blank. Cheese, right? Like brie. Oh my gosh. Like macaroni and cheese. But my thought whenever I hear that is, well, you don't know how bad I felt, right? I feel so good by comparison now that I would do just about anything, including giving up more things if it meant that I got to feel better than I did 5 years ago. Yeah.
I think that's what makes I I value so many things that you guys do, but I think the thing that I value most is that you show how alpha-gal syndrome, which is really tragic for a lot of people, is something that you can just grab by the horns and turn into something that's a really positive experience. And it really embodies an attitude that I think is like core to leading a happy, successful life. And I like to call it skipping through hell. Skipping through hell. Bad things happen to everybody. You know, we have disappointments. We are confronted with limitations that we didn't expect to have. And alpha-gal syndrome kind of epitomizes that. And you guys take that difficulty and show people how you can use this to transform your life in really positive ways. You find the humor in it. You find the opportunities in it. Like just that lunch that we had yesterday, where I let Candace, for your listeners, I let Candace pick my lunch. I'm like, because it was at a restaurant where you guys have eaten before. And it was just so delicious. I mean, would your lunch have been that good before you got alpha-gal syndrome? It probably wouldn't have been.
not.
You would have had something that wasn't anywhere near as nutritious or delicious. So that's just an incredible gift to our community.
Oh, thanks, Sharon.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that and for following like our conversation about I would kill myself if I had to give up hamburgers. It's so nice to hear you say that because I feel like it came out of necessity for us, right? We could wallow in these feelings and I'm not saying to anybody not to acknowledge the grief that comes with this diagnosis, the grief that comes with giving up things that you love, but for Candace and I, and for you too, Sharon, I know you're this way, we had to find a way out, a way to still be able to live with this while living with joy. And so I kind of want to drive that point home too to people who are listening that it's really possible. I mean, yeah, we had to give up stuff, but I don't really even miss much of the food anymore. I said mac and cheese because I've had it on the brain lately, but I don't really miss it. I'm fine with that. They're like, give me some jackfruit tacos.
I miss those, Vietnamese, those little Vietnamese egg rolls, chagio that have the pork in them.
Yeah.
That's like my shit.
Well, I'm so glad
really
that you.
miss those.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you liked the bowl yesterday at Root because
oh my gosh, it was absolutely delicious. I'm still thinking about it. But, in a more serious note, one of the first people that reached out to me after I created my website was a dad whose adolescent son had developed alpha-gal syndrome. And he didn't have a way forward. And unfortunately, he took his own life. So showing people the way forward and that there is a way forward and that can be joyful is enormously important. Like what if that kid had you guys as models for how to do that? Maybe he'd still be here.
Yeah. I mean,
but that's just how serious it can be for some people. And I agree, you have to grieve, but then you have to also be able to see
the light,
a way forward.
Yeah. And I think that was what was so important for us. Like we had been in the dark, like I had been at some of the lowest points in my life for 4 months. And it is, but I've told Debbie this a million times. Like I'll never forget one of my friends, Sarah, came over And she helped me to the bathroom, and she made me look in the mirror and say, I am strong. I am healthy. I will get through this. And I didn't believe it at first, but I think had I not done a lot of my own mental health work and, introspection and all of these things prior to my diagnosis, it would have been a lot harder to step into it. But we want to show people that you can take that step, but you have to get to that place of acceptance and take the step, even if it's a small step, in saying those things to yourself that are positive, but it's what you can do right now. And then it will start to snowball more into this positive experience versus this negative experience, and so it is, I don't know, we felt like it's what our calling is, what our pull is, and our purpose is within this community is to be the light,
Absolutely. You guys just do it so well.
Thank you. It means a ton. Like, it means so much to hear it from you. And I really appreciate that.
Yes, same here. And it's interesting because you can take a step back too and see the big picture, right? It's hard to see it sometimes when you're in the weeds, but now here we are 4 or 5 years after our diagnoses, all three of us, and look at what we're doing, right? Instead of the 5,000 number that we had heard back in 2019, that jumped up to 35,000, we're talking as close to 500,000 now, and we're talking about it in the state of Virginia, like as a state bill that it's got potential to really have impact. So I think it's important to look at these big things that have happened. Things felt so incremental for so long, and I think they have to a lot of the times. But now, if you look in the last 5 years, there have been some really big jumps that have taken place, and we're ready to only push forward from here, right? All of us together with our voice. I feel like we can come together and our voice can be that much louder, right? And there are more organizations, like as you were listing, the people that are so instrumental and in playing their role that we all complement each other, and I think we're only going good places from here.
I couldn't agree more. And I also think, I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel like we've made more progress in the last couple of years than I thought was possible,
100%.
both in terms of awareness, the number of people diagnosed, and awareness about like the full spectrum of how alpha-gal syndrome manifests. In 2022, almost nobody understood there was a gastroenterological variant of alpha-gal syndrome where it just seemed like you had IBS. And now, thanks to Sarah McGill's efforts at UNC, like this is the hottest topic in the GI community. Like I'm beginning to think that maybe gastroenterologists know more about alpha-gal syndrome than allergists on average. So that is very exciting. I honestly thought that was going to take a decade to happen.
Yes, that is so exciting. And I'm so glad that you shared that too, because it's great to hear that it's sort of taking hold, to that people are starting to pay attention to that GI variant, to the data there and Dr. McGill's work. Because I think as someone who lived with those GI symptoms for so long, to understand, or to have known, 5 years prior to my diagnosis that I could have really helped those symptoms by changing my diet and lifestyle, I would have been a game changer. And so now I want to like shout it from the rooftops, right? Like if you have IBS, check for alpha-gal syndrome, because there might be an easy solution, but we know it's not easy, but there might be a solution to actually relieving your symptoms. And that's huge.
And for your listeners who aren't already aware of this, you guys did a great podcast with Dr. McGill, which is definitely worth listening to. But yeah, I think it's actually a huge percentage of people who have alpha-gal syndrome actually have that GI variant. And there's one little study that was actually done in Virginia that suggests that up to a quarter of people who are presenting with IBS-like symptoms, abdominal pain and diarrhea actually have alpha-gal syndrome.
Mm.
I mean, it's just a little study and, we need more data, but I found those numbers really shocking.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And little studies turn into big studies, hopefully. Yeah.
A little
Yeah.
help from the NIH.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I also think it's like when we talk about Virginia and, being a hotspot of alpha-gal syndrome, there are so many other implications that really go beyond just the people that have full-blown alpha-gal syndrome. There are areas of Virginia that, based on this data that we have from this military study, where the prevalence is, over 35% of the population are sensitized to alpha-gal, which is not the same thing as having alpha-gal syndrome, but they have the allergic antibody. The people that don't even have the allergy are also at risk of certain things. Like, for example, a lot of those people who don't, might eat red meat without having any problems, would likely react if they received cetuximab, that cancer drug cetuximab. And we know of at least 11 people who've died from that drug just because of alpha-gal reactions.
Wow.
And then there are also people within that community who we are now thinking might be at risk for, might have an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So we're just beginning to learn about what it really means to have this allergic antibody to alpha-gal, which affects such a large percentage of the population in Virginia that goes beyond even just having the allergy. So I think that's another reason why documenting the numbers is important.
Yeah. And I think when you just reminded me of something, we've talked about this a lot with you. We actually talked about this yesterday, is that there's so much unknown of, how ticks truly change us, how it's truly affecting us on so many levels. And with, is there a connection with autoimmunity? And like, there's just so much unknown. So I think that's what got Debbie and I so excited about having the opportunity to share our voice and why we supported, this bill being passed, because hopefully it will lead to, more answers.
I couldn't agree more. And I mean, as you know all too well, Candace, it seems like either alpha-gal syndrome directly or tick bites, maybe independent of alpha-gal syndrome, seem to be triggering mast cell activation syndrome, or at least symptoms consistent with it in a lot of us. And at UVA, they're talking about how they think tick bites independent of alpha-gal syndrome can trigger chronic hives.
Wow.
So who knows? Maybe we just kind of stumbled across alpha-gal syndrome because of these severe reactions to this cancer drug. And the link to ticks was just made almost inadvertently. So who knows how ticks are reprogramming our immune systems. It's really kind of scary, but maybe alpha-gal is the tip of the iceberg. We don't really know at this point.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah. But I feel optimistic, which is weird. Like when we're talking about it, I feel optimistic that we're moving in the right direction to get those answers. Is it going to come tomorrow? No, probably not. But I feel like slowly we're going to get more and more answers to understand not just alpha-gal, but tick bites and maybe some autoimmune things that we didn't understand before in the connection. And I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful.
And allergy in general. I mean, the important thing about alpha-gal syndrome from a research perspective is that it goes way beyond alpha-gal syndrome. It relates to all these other, like, maybe these immunological, weird tick-related immunological reactions can help explain chronic Lyme disease.
Right.
But in the allergy space, the Australian expert likes to call alpha-gal syndrome allergy in a box. And what she means is that, like, it represents this incredible opportunity to understand how allergies work, because it's the only allergy that we know how it's triggered and can study that. So fundamental research on the cellular and biochemical mechanisms that underlie alpha-gal syndrome and how it's induced are going to be absolutely critical for understanding allergy in general and how allergies arise. So, AGS at the forefront for everything.
Yes.
It really is just constantly changing paradigms.
Yeah.
People didn't used to think that allergies could be delayed. People didn't used to think that you could be allergic to a carbohydrate. People didn't used to think that an allergy could present as chronic GI issues. And research on alpha-gal syndrome just keeps shifting medical paradigms, which is why I think it's so important to raise money for it.
Yes. Hands
Another
Absolutely.
reason why we need the numbers with
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to add.
Our researchers can make a better argument for getting the research funded.
Right. So we will, for our listeners, follow us on social media. We will be updating this, as the HB 93 bill moves forward. I know there's a lot of steps, right, Sharon? Like it's going to different committees now.
Yes, it's got to work its way through the system, first in the House and then the Senate.
Okay. So we will be keeping that conversation going as things develop. So Sharon, I'm going to ask you because we have to ask this question. We didn't really any time to prepare for this.
I first am going to reserve the right to take the fifth, but
I mean, people do say this is the hardest question, but you know how much we love music, how much music brings us joy. So we would love to know if there's a song or an artist that is your favorite that brings you joy now or for all time. Can you share with us who or what that might be?
Yeah, there actually is. It's just because you put me on the spot like this that I do have a favorite song, and just because you asked me, I'm now forgetting the name. It's Nina Simone, but what's the name of the song?
Feeling good?
Yeah, exactly. That would be it. Feeling
Good. The proper name? Is that the right title? Oh.
I really ought to know.
Oh no, that's right. It's Feeling Good.
Feeling Good by Nina Simone. Yeah. I love to listen to that song, especially in moments where some positive change has occurred.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, hopefully you'll be listening to it more and more and more and more.
Yeah, I'm just going to put it on the loop.
That's right. For all this positive change that's happening.
Yes, love her. And she was such a force in so many ways. So
Such a force. And you know what? You guys are a force. And just in general, our community is a force. At one point, the really, really wonderful delegate who wrote HB3, Delegate Otto Waxman, sent me a text saying, I can't believe how much support there is for this. And I just texted him back and said, the alpha-gal syndrome community is a force to be reckoned with. And I think it's true.
I think it is too.
We're so much more motivated because of the difficulty of our disease. We have gathered in hundreds of support groups, and we have among the largest support groups of any allergy community. I think there's one support group that's devoted to a particular allergy that's bigger than our support groups, but there's just so much possibility there for organizing for change between the level of motivation and the numbers of people who are accessible through social media. So yeah, this is just the beginning. We're here, and we're going to fight for change.
Yes, so true. And Sharon, we want to thank you for being a force in this community as well, and the impact that you've had. It's hard to even put it into words when you think about alpha-gal information, but thank you for continuing to be a force to fight for this cause. It's really wonderful, and thank you for being here with us today to talk a little bit about HB 93, about your journey, and about, all things alpha-gal.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun, as it is every time I ever chat with you guys.
Oh, yay.
We feel the same way.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll be able to have another conversation soon. We appreciate you, Sharon.
Thank you so much.
Until next time. Thank you for joining us today on In the Tall Grass. Visit us at 2alphagals.com. That's TWO alphagals.com. Or you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at 2alphagals. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a review and help us grow this community.
We're all faced with obstacles on our journey, whether it be food allergies or tick-borne diseases. You might outgrow the reactions, but you won't outgrow the person you become. Ticks suck, but life doesn't have to.